Well, good morning. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, welcome back to our webinar series, Exploring Prescribed Fire for Forest Management. Before we begin today, we acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies land of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. My name is Gary Werner, and I'm a longtime volunteer with the Ice Age Trail Alliance and the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I've spent more than 30 years working along the Ice Age National Scenic Trail in southern Wisconsin to rescue remnants of native prairie and oak savanna that were on lands too steep or rocky to plow, and therefore were left alone by the agriculture of the last couple hundred years. But thanks to presentations I've seen by Jed, our presenter today, and other scholars, I've come to realize that these little bits of native or natural Wisconsin landscape that we're working to try to rescue and restore are actually remnants of the landscapes that were created by the fire management or the fires used by the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee to manage the land of Wisconsin before our ancestors from Europe arrived. So there's a very tangible connection between the topic that Jed's going to be talking about today and actual practice of work on the land. In this series, the speakers that have been recruited for it explore the many facets of prescribed fire related to forests and forest management. They are invited to provide their perspectives and offer advice on how we can advance prescribed fire as a forest management tool in the future. And we don't expect those speakers or anyone to have definitive answers about what the future will look like. Rather, we hope this series will provide insights, pose questions, and stimulate our collective thinking. Before I introduce our guest, we have a few quick housekeeping items to review. Session recordings, additional resources, evaluation links, and information about continuing education will all be available on the website. We will do our best to ensure the recordings are posted within 2 weeks of today's session. To receive continuing education, you must complete the Microsoft form provided to you during the session. This link will be posted periodically throughout today in the chat. If you have any questions, please email wfc@uwsp.edu. You see that in the bottom of the screen. This webinar series is hosted by the Wisconsin Forestry Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry. An evaluation link will be provided later this morning, and we hope you'll provide feedback so we can continue to improve our series. Although you are attending virtually, we still want to hear from you. Please type any questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The chat function may not be monitored for questions, but our technical host is monitoring for content. We will do our best to address all questions and comments, but may be limited by time. Before we begin today, please say hi and let us know where you are listening from. And last but not least, we sincerely appreciate our sponsors for making this opportunity free for all attendees. Today, we would like to highlight our series platinum sponsor, the National Wild Turkey Federation, and our series gold sponsors, the Ruffed Grouse Society, American Woodcock Society, and the Nature Conservancy. And now it's time to welcome today's presenter. Jed Mounier is an ecologist and research scientist within the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry. His work relates to the conservation and sustainable management of natural resources. Jed has expertise in disturbance ecology, which translates well into management issues, whether they be the harvest of wildlife or timber, understanding natural disturbance like fire, or the use of fire to meet particular management objectives. His dissertation research was on fire ecology in northern Mexico, investigating spatial and temporal aspects of fire in relation to climate and land use over several centuries. Jed received his MS in the Wildlife Ecology Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying the effects of hunting on declining American woodcock populations. Jed considers himself lucky to spend his time asking questions and through applied research to assist in the management of Wisconsin's many treasures. So, welcome, Jed.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks everyone for being here. Fun to see some old friends pop up on the introduction list. It's a beautiful day here in southern Wisconsin, and it's a busy time of year. So I'm pleased to see many of you here with us today. So I'm going to kind of be taking a broad slice of fire and carbon dynamics, and I'm going to frame that around a couple of parts. I want to introduce this idea of fire regimes and how that's linked to carbon. And then I'm going to give some specific examples, really focused on sort of the bookends, if you will, of dry mesic forests in the lake states to really soggy wet ground, wetlands in the lake states, and some of my research and how that informs that. And then I'll try to really briefly put a cap on all of that and what does it mean. So this is sort of, the biggest picture as a starting point. This is the graph on the left is the Keeling curve. Charles Keeling set up a carbon dioxide monitoring station in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on top of Mauna Loa in the 50s, and it's a continuous data set from that point on, and really it's one of the most famous data sets perhaps in the world. So I suspect most or all of you have seen this. And what's fascinating to me is we tend to focus on that black line in the Keeling curve, and it's showing the exponential increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So that should be familiar. What I really like about it, though, is the actual data points are that red line that sort of oscillate around the mean or the black line. And so those actual data points are, Mauna Loa is in the northern hemisphere. And what those are the seasonal changes, right? So in the spring where we are now, there's lots of growing things, green things getting started, leafing out, flowering. They're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. In the fall, the opposite happens. Leaves are falling to the ground, decomposition is occurring, and all this respiration associated with it. And so really it's this the lungs, right? It's this inhale and exhale And so what it's showing is the sensitivity of Earth to biological fluctuations. And that's just pretty cool in my mind. And so it's no surprise really when we think about the ability of growing things to change the carbon balance on planet Earth, that we turn to tree planting as a solution for climate change. So most of you or many of you have probably heard of the Trillion Trees campaign. So this really got started from a postdoc at Yale School of Forestry who did two things that had never really been done before. The first thing he did was he counted all the trees on planet Earth, 3 trillion roughly. And then he determined the space, if you will, or the ability of Earth. How many more trees could we accommodate? And that answer is about another trillion trees. And so this was a campaign. It's active and ongoing. Wisconsin was one of the early adopters of this. Our governor, Evers, pledged that we would initially 75, now 100 million trees we will plant, in addition to the number of trees we already plant by Earth Day 2030. And interestingly, in the original Wisconsin pledge, we also were going to conserve 125,000 acres. And then there was language about restoring, managing land, but that really, in my mind, those last 2 points have fallen by the wayside. Our focus collectively is really on tracking metrics for how many trees we're putting in the ground. And so, sequestration is just a part of that puzzle, right? Of the carbon dynamic. But the ability to store or hold carbon for long periods of time is also really important. And so we know, for example, that harvest of trees can be a carbon emissions, or at least, how many of those trillion trees that get planted will be alive in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. So there's both a spatial and temporal scale component that's really important. I think when I look at this graphic from the Forest Stewards Guild on what matters in quality logging operations, I'm reminded that in some ways the old mantra of think globally, act locally has arrived, right? So the loggers that are associated with the Forest Stewards Guild may not be typical in all ways, but it is indicative to me. And so I would suggest that these pieces of the pie probably would have been had different labels 5, 10, certainly 15 years ago. And so carbon sequestration is one piece of that pie, but understanding how to increase resilience, preparing for wildfires, structurally diverse habitats. So this is pretty holistic stuff. The other point that I think is really interesting about this is that in order to do any of these things or to understand them, we have to understand disturbance regimes. And so staying pretty high level for a moment here, I want to just use sort of maybe the mountainous West as an example. So again, these are sort of are different elevations. So what's really cool about mountain country is you can sort of predict two things. So you can predict that cold air can hold less moisture than warm air. So as air rises, it dumps precipitation in a fairly predictable manner. And so because of that orographic lifting, we can basically predict something about fuels and in turn fire regimes. So as we go up the mountain into subalpine forests, much of which is one of those communities would be lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine are very fire resilient. So they have serotinous cones. When a fire occurs, it occurs very infrequently, climate-driven events. But when that fire occurs, it's going to kill the trees, the parent trees. But in doing so, it'll melt the resins of these serotinous cones, and a new forest originates. So that's an example of a fire resilient landscape, one that bounces back from a disturbance into its sort of pre-disturbance state and function. Going down the mountain, we get into the montane forest. This is more arid country, and so a classic example would be ponderosa pine forest in much of the southwest United States. And here it's a very different dynamic. These trees are resistant to change. They're meant to survive fires. And so, and of course, they have a very different fire return interval. And so I want to just stick with these bookends and thinking about carbon for a moment. So this is work by Dan Cashin, Bill Rami, who was my postdoc or my PhD advisor, and some others. And they're working in Yellowstone National Park. So in 1988, a sort of unprecedented event happened, and that 800,000 acres approximately of Yellowstone burned. And we had never seen that scale of fire before. And so what Dan Cashin and Bill Rami and colleagues have done here is they've really tried to look at this in terms of its carbon dynamic. So what you had is in 1988, these pretty much mostly high severity fires in a system like I just showed you in lodgepole pine. And so the blue line here is net ecosystem productivity. And so think of that as all the green growing things that are sequestering carbon, pulling carbon into that system. And so in 1988, all those green things died. And so you had this plummet. And anything below negative here is a carbon source, and anything positive is a carbon sink. So you had these things that were green and growing die, and your net ecosystem productivity just tanks. But what happens is, it does not take long for the new forest to be reborn. And as those young trees are growing and green, they're sequestering carbon, and sometimes rapidly. So in just a few years' time, the trend reverses. And in a number of decades, you see that actually the net ecosystem productivity overshoots where it started on this dashed line. And so then you get stand thinning over time, and a change in that sort of the sequestering carbon over time. So that's one part of that puzzle. The other part, when you're thinking about carbon, is the total carbon or storage in the system over time. And so, you have all these dead sticks still standing from the 88 fire. It takes about, 15 or 20 years for those standing dead trees to fall and hit the ground. And really the flames, the 1988 fires themselves initiated a pulse of carbon into the atmosphere, but most of the emissions from that carbon happen after those trees are dead and down and decomposition occurs, microbial activity. And it's the respiration from that microbial activity that releases carbon. And so it takes a very long time for the total accounting to come back to basically zero. And the important part here is that really after about 230 years, there's no difference in the carbon dynamics and the carbon balance, I should say, in that system, assuming you have reforestation, assuming that it regenerates as really most or much of that landscape did after the 1988 fires. So this is the cool part. And the cool part is that really the carbon dynamics follow the fire regime dynamics beautifully. So I showed you that the fire return interval in a subalpine lodgepole forest is somewhere between 200 and 300 years. Bam, right on the money. That's the carbon cycle as well. And so going down the mountain again into that montane forest, and now we're shifting as an example into the north rim of the Grand Canyon, the Kaibab Plateau. And so this is a picture of that area, what it might have looked like, what it did look like in 1905. And what you see are widely spaced ponderosa pine, grassy understory. In this system, much of the carbon is below ground. It's probably, depending on where you are on the plateau, it could shift between most of the carbon being below ground to similar amounts above and below ground to maybe in some denser areas, more carbon above ground. So, but the important part is here, as a fire comes through every 10, 15 years, it's really not changing the carbon dynamic balance very much. Because most of that carbon is probably safely tucked away below ground. Again, we're in the northern hemisphere. These grasses will senesce and die. And so whether they're burned every 7 or 10 years or whether they senesce and die, it's really just a slight variation in the temporal scale of those dynamics. But it's a very fire resistant and carbon resistant landscape. It's resisting change. Now, if we fast forward to somewhere today, many parts of the Grand Canyon or the North Rim, if you walk around, there are portions of the Kaibab where if you were to walk around blindfolded, 7 out of every 10 trees that you would touch were probably from 1 year alone, 1919. But really, this forest stems primarily between most of those trees originate between 1900 and 1930. It was this massive tree eruption, is what we refer to it as. It was a perfect storm of fire suppression, cattle, and really warm, wet winters that really contributed to that. But anyway, so this is a very different forest. Most of the carbon, we potentially even gained our carbon storage on this landscape in above ground carbon. However, these forests are not. This stand is not resistant to wildfires. It's going to probably carry a crown fire, and it really will change the carbon dynamics of that stand. So that's kind of familiar, I think, to most of us. This example in particular. So this is where, changing fire regimes have really altered carbon dynamics. And the important thing here is that really it's this structure is key. Okay, so let's bring it closer to home. So what does this mean in the case here of Wisconsin or the eastern United States, where we can't predict precipitation and temperature as cleanly, say, as a mountainous region. And so I would argue in Wisconsin, we really are just beginning to understand our fire regimes. Therefore, we are just beginning to understand our carbon dynamics among the systems in the lake states in eastern United States. And so, if we think about red pine as one example, so the way that we sort of conceptualize disturbance dynamics in red pine dominated forests is that we had a punctuated mortality, usually wind throw, followed by a catastrophic fire or a high severity fire. And then we had punctuated recruitment. Then we had a new stand was born from those high severity events. And so we think about them as having been even age, single cohort, kind of simple systems. And so, most of our red pine forests in the lake states now is plantation origin. And if you think about it, we manage, we treat, we think about natural origin red pine and plantation as being sort of similar or almost the same in terms of their dynamics. We might thin them over time and then slick off the stand and start over. And so this is a quote from Derek Churchill, one of Jerry Franklin's students, who has done a lot of work on spatial patterning. To increase resilience, we need to restore the range of patterns found in forests with intact disturbance regimes. So if the paradigm I've described to you is correct, then really we are emulating the disturbance regime with just harvest, probably. Something approximating that. So this is an old picture. It's gritty when it's not projected. It's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. You could probably see 3 individuals standing in the foreground of some sort of charred boles of this sort of mixed conifer forest. And then these are basal injuries that I have circled here, and those are indicative of low severity, frequent fire systems. So a little bit of a different picture than what I just described. And, density, what constitutes a savanna from a woodland, from a forest, is somewhat academic, but largely this is a forested system of the Upper Peninsula. And the quote comes from Northwest Wisconsin, and this was probably a very common scene throughout the lake states. And so this is where my work comes in. I have one of the many hats that I wear is that of a dendrochronologist or tree ring person. Dendro, tree chronology, study of time through tree rings. And so this is what that business looks like, where I've collected evidence of these low severity fires. So these are trees like this one that have survived numerous fires. And then, and most of the samples that we collect are more like this, where they were cut down in the mid 1800s with the cutover. And we're collecting remnants of those now and reconstructing fire history through time with those samples. And so I've worked really all over the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Wisconsin, but these are some of those sites. These are our this is our piney area of the state of Wisconsin shown here, primarily focused on 5 different landscapes. I'm gonna show you a little bit of data from a handful of those landscapes, a subset of that data where we collected more intensive information, including the spatial patterning of trees. And so one of those sites is illustrated here, the Togatic River in the Northwest Sand. So red pine dominated site. And what you're looking at here in this top figure is a fire history graph. And if you haven't seen these before, they're not too complicated. So just bear with me. So each one of these horizontal lines is a sample. It's one of those stumps, or in some cases, a recently dead tree or a snag. And so there's maybe 30 different samples here. And each one of these inverted triangles is a fire event recorded on that sample. And then at the bottom, we have a composite where we're able to say, show me the fires that occur on, say, 10% of or more of the samples. And so with that composite, we can calculate a mean fire return interval. And so for this site, the Togatic River, the mean fire return interval is about 7 years. And so this is an example of one site of many, but this is the kind of data we're finding all over, right? And so that's a rather frequent fire regime. And so the bottom data is age structure. So pyre is Pinus resinosa, red pine, white pine, and then deciduous lumped. And so what we're asking here is we're basically looking at pith dates, when these trees were born. And so you can see sort of a 50-year period of recruitment here, a blip of recruitment here, et cetera. And so what that's showing us is that we had not punctuated mortality, but we had low, regular but low levels of mortality occurring continuously with frequent fire. And then we didn't have punctuated recruitment. We had low but continuous levels of recruitment over time in the presence of those fires. So really, this is kind of the exact opposite scenario of what we have sort of operated under for the last 100 years or more of pine management in the lake states. And so thinking about it in terms of density, again, getting back a little bit to the carbon dynamics, what we're seeing in resistance and resilience, we see stands now, and these are some of our best of the best. These are old growth sites in the lake states, or in this case in Wisconsin. And these stands are on average 12 times more dense than they were circa 1860. And so, even though these are in all cases natural origin red pine stands, there are many cases old growth stands that weren't harvested, but in all cases, they're way out of balance from what they were in terms of density historically, we think. Okay, some last bit of data from those 8 sites that I was showing you. So again, this is the same site, I think, the Togatic River that I showed you the fire history and age structure data for in the Northwest. So in this case, we have this big half-hectare plot, and we stem mapped the various stems of trees and took tree cores and took samples of stumps, logs, everything, and tried to grow that stand back in time. And we spatially mapped it. And so what we've got is this is a spatial analysis. And so we're looking at the pattern of those trees. So this is what we'd expect. This is the red line, our hypothesis, completely spatially random. And this is gray as our confidence interval. And what we're finding is that these historically trees were clustered. They were clumpy groupy at all spatial scales, which we analyzed them for. And currently, our forests, and again, these are some of our best of the best old growth stands. Currently, they're completely spatially random. So not only are trees on average 12 times, these stands 12 times more dense, but the spatial patterning is completely different. And so why that matters is when we see, this is not one of my stands, but this is sort of the patterning we would expect historically, right? This is a clump of trees with small, medium, and large openings. Um, it could have the same basal area, but currently, even at a relatively low basal area, these are sort of uniformly distributed trees. So if you had enough wind, you could sustain crown fire in this sort of situation. Whereas the top picture, it's virtually impossible to sustain crown fire with that, more heterogeneous, clumpy, groupy pattern. And so if we think about that in terms of resistance, and this is a case just like the Kaibab Plateau from 1905 to the current, where we are really, really changing potentially not just the fire regime, the spatial patterning, but really the carbon dynamics should a fire or when a fire occurs. And so this is data now. We looked at, I forget the number, but we could count them. There's approximately 7 sites in Minnesota and 8 sites in Wisconsin. These are data from these sites in Minnesota. So I'm not showing you Wisconsin data at this point, but this is from a recent paper that I published with a colleague, Elena Razenkova. And so what we did was we went to all these old growth stands and we stem mapped all the trees and what we're after. So we also mapped canopies of these trees. And what we're finding is that a radii of an old growth red pine canopy is about 6 meters. And so that is kind of also the magic number we're finding for when we had kind of a really nice distribution of scattered individuals, of small clumps of trees, 2 to 4 trees, medium clumps of more, say 5 to 9 trees, and large clumps of 10 or more trees. And so really this is where at about 5 to 6 meters, and there's some variability here, but the dark blue is a large clump, right? And the gray is individuals. So currently, uh, these stands, so this is the historical structure of these stands. So at 5 to 6 meters, we had a sort of a distribution of small, medium, large clumps usually and individuals. Whereas today, at just 4 or 5 meters, it is solid dark blue, meaning at 4 meters, we have one contiguous stand. So I hope that makes sense. So at 1 meter, trees, if we were to think about 1 meter being the rule of what constitutes a neighbor tree being part of a clump, they're all individuals. And the sweet spot we think is about 5 or 6 meters. And so that's just giving you sort of an indication at a broader scale of what I was talking about. Like these things are not they're not structurally they're not really representative of what they were at one point in time. And so um, this is sort of so now I've been talking about pine forests sort of at large, right? The 1871 Peshtigo fire, I'll just briefly mention that. But that was one of these settlement era really destructive fires in our history. Killed upwards of 1,500 people. Um, I'm not going to get into this in any detail about these European settlement era fires, but this one deserves special mention, right? So this is the map of the 1.2 million acres that burned in that 1871 October fire. And then you look at the place names, Upper, Middle, and Lower Sugarbush, Birch Creek. I took the footprint of that high severity portion of the Peshtigo fire, and I pulled out all the General Land Office witness trees that were collected in the mid 1800s in that part of Wisconsin. And basically what you can see is it was a very mesic forest. So this is that subalpine forest. This is more equivalent to the lodgepole pine. This is a forest we would expect to burn with high severity and high intensity, unlike the forests I've been talking about, which were the pine forests. So, and again, what's fascinating is this is a map of the burnt district of 1871. And so what is now the Menominee Reservation and Oconto and Marinette counties, those are our piney landscapes where we had lots of evidence of low severity fire. But anyway, so this is, I don't have this completely worked out necessarily, but I just think we need to be really careful when we're thinking about, fire regimes and fires generally. we should be thinking about forest types and fuel types and what that means for potential carbon dynamics. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. So if we're talking about carbon and we really would be it would be an error not to talk about at least mention below ground carbon. And so largely what I've been discussing so far, this is a schematic of just sort of broadly different biomes around the world and where carbon is stored. So I've been focused on temperate forests. And again, this is showing us that we have about the same amount of carbon above and below ground in temperate forests. That varies a little bit depending on, forest type. But really, you know, uh, it's wetlands. If that bar doesn't stick out to us, then we're really missing a big part of the picture. So wetlands are really our carbon-rich environments and deserve some thought and some mention. And of the different regions of the country, we stick out globally. We're globally significant for the amount of carbon in our wetlands. So this is sort of honing in on the eastern and upper Midwest. But we have some very carbon rich environments that we should be thinking about. And of wetlands, the heaviest hitters are by far and away peatlands. So it's estimated that peatlands are about 3% of the Earth's surface, and they hold more than twice the amount of carbon of all Earth's forests combined. So they're really, really carbon-rich environments. And the secret, the magic to peatlands are sphagnum mosses. So sphagnum moss can hold 26 times their weight in water, and they sequester carbon well, and they don't fully decompose, and so they build up over time in these really, really carbon-rich environments. So the picture here is of a fire that occurred in the Hiawatha National Forest in the Upper Peninsula while I was there with a graduate student I was co-advising, collecting data on historical fire regimes of peatlands, which I'm going to go into now. But really the point here is that this is a very common phenomena that we have these fires in these peatlands, and the managers up there in the Forest Service were really looking to us saying, what do we do? So these are some of our largest fires. They're some of our most intractable fires to fight. They're smoldering fires. They're very difficult to deal with. And so the managers are saying, are these good or are these bad? So that's the level of ignorance here. We don't know whether we should fight them, even if we could allow them to go or not. So this was the beginning of a project. And there's really, thinking about these peatland systems, they're scattered around the world. They tend to develop well at high latitudes, but they're even, we have equatorial peatlands. And there was in Indonesia in 2015, there was a huge, huge area of really deep burning peat fires that probably emitted more carbon than even some of the biggest Western wildfires we hear of today. But these smoldering fires just don't gain as much attention. I will say Indonesia has had fires in peatlands since 2015, but they've done a much better job at not manipulating the hydrology and draining those peatlands, and they've fared much better. But these fires are interesting, right? Zombie fires, that's a term you may hear. So we like to talk a lot about fire ecologists. We spend time talking about lightning ignition, human ignition. We tend to spend some thought on that, but really, we have fires burning for months and sometimes even years. There are coal seam fires in the eastern United States that have been burning for decades. And so this is an example of this was a headline of a fire that burned all winter long under the snowpack, which probably was not unusual in our region either. And so when the way we understand peatlands and peatland fire is usually through paleo methods. So these are, sediment cores from lakes or peats, and it's, you collect these cores and you see spikes of char, and you could radiocarbon date those. So the important things, this is also from Indonesia, sticking with the global scale for a moment. The things to think of or to take note of here is the frequency. So really we're talking, events per 1,000 years. So different time scale than certainly I've been talking about with tree ring data. The other thing to notice is that, on that time scale, so this is going back in time to the right. This is present, and this is, before present. And so over time, we can see an increase in fire frequency in this region, and we also see an increase in carbon accumulation rates. So this is really, really important. And really, a lot of the paleo data is similar to this, and it shows that, we often have a rapid accumulation or a high accumulation rate of carbon during warm periods and fire frequent periods. And I'll come back to that point. So getting back to the project that I started with Colleen Sutheimer, we worked across the upper lake states, Wisconsin and the UP of Minnesota, in various sort of pore fin peat systems to understand to try to reconstruct fire history. And so this is a map of land fire, and it's kind of showing, the dots are some of the areas we collected fire scar information. So what we tried to do is we tried to find these large peatland complexes, and we tried to hike way out into the middle of them into these small little islands of pine. When you have a foot elevation change, an old ancient sand dune, it probably will have pine and it probably had fire. And so we were able to reconstruct fire there. And then we tried to ring it. We tried to work around the uplands surrounding those peatlands. And what's this map is showing us, this is land fire's fire return interval. So the peats themselves we think of as burning, but every, say, 1,000 to, on the order of many hundreds to thousands of years between fires. Whereas, the little pine pockets embedded and surrounding them, we think of as burning, much more frequently than that. And so this is one example of an island, and these trees are all fire scarred, a small little island in the middle of a peatland. And I should say, we also collected peat sediments and lake sediments as part of this project to try to compare, like you can see char bands in this peat in this sediment, but there's a background signal. So we were interested in, do these paleo methods capture low severity fire as well? And that really is a different part of this project. I'm just going to focus on the tree ring part. And so these are those data. And you guys are now experts at reading fire history graphs, right? So every one of these lines is a sample. And in this case, these vertical lines are fires. The peatlands, these are the little islands and stuff within the peatland complex. And these are the sort of the surrounding pine landscape, pine forest. And so what you see is, so we, first of all, rather than fires per 1,000 years, we're finding mean fire return intervals between 5 and about 35 years. So much, much more frequently. And so the widespread fire years are years where we have a fair level of confidence. These are fire years that burned across the entire system. So they burned the peatlands and the uplands. These are the more synchronous fire events. And in many cases, these are years like 1891, we know burned, it's a very widespread fire year and probably burned millions of acres, actually. But sticking with these peatlands, so we start to get a very different picture than we do with that paleo data, thinking that fire was much more frequent. And so the other thing to note, so this is Palmer Drought Severity Index. Negative values are dry, positive are wet. And so we basically said on the year of a fire, year 0, what was the Palmer Drought Severity for all those fire years? And then if we draw random years at large, a 1,000 different iterations, what were the climate, what was the Palmer Drought Severity the year before a fire, 2 years before a fire, and then after a fire? And so we see that, the black bars are significantly dry. And this is all fires, big and small. This is bigger fires, and these are really big fires. Those are the ones that are sort of landscape scale. And so we see that, a couple of dry years, a year before and the year of a fire, and we had these larger fire years. But the important thing to note here is, while this is a significant relationship and these are dry conditions, a negative 0.5 Palmer drought severity index is really, really moderate. So what we're talking about is dry, but this is not significant drought. It would not even classify as droughty. These are just moderately dry years when we were having fires in these peatlands. And so again, so this is now not in Indonesia, but this is boreal forests of north of eastern Canada, and it's showing the same kind of relationship that basically as fire frequency goes up, we have a higher carbon accumulation. Now that's paleo data, and the data here is really fascinating. So this is by Neil Flanagan at Duke University and colleagues, and what they did was they looked at low severity fire from Minnesota, North Carolina, Florida, all the way to Peru. And they studied the role of low severity fire in decomposition. And what they found was that fire directly affects microbial activity, slowing down decomposition. Now, why this is so important is like when we think about the spruce station in the Marcel Experimental Forest in northern Minnesota, data from that where they manipulated temperature. So they basically are trying to manipulate a warming world under climate change. And what they found was that when you increase the temperature, you might increase net primary productivity. You get more green things growing, but rather than adding carbon into storage, that with a warming temperature, you increase microbial activity. And that is the mechanism for turning these peatlands from carbon sinks to carbon sources, increased microbial activity with warming. What Neil Flanagan's work is telling us is that we have a mechanism to actually slow microbial activity. And so this is really kind of, in my mind, the smoking gun. How? How did we have increased carbon storage in a warming world with increased fire? That's almost counterintuitive. And I think Neil Flanagan's work is really getting at the mechanism for how that could have happened. And so it's really, really kind of neat. Now, this is a map from the New York Times they published a while back, but I really like it. And they basically said that, that we are at two worlds here, right? That in the eastern United States, in the last 30 years, we've gotten on average 4 to 5 inches wetter than the 100 years prior to that. Whereas in the western United States, it's a whole different ball game. And so, this is the kind of data that I think is important. Like the ability of peatlands to function as the lungs of Earth and sequester carbon as they do so well, you have to have intact hydrology. As soon as you manipulate the hydrology, bad things happen. You get deeper burning fires that are more equivalent to the 2015 fires in Indonesia. And so the Western United States, that is a big concern, especially in Western Canada. We have a very different scenario here potentially, and a very different maybe opportunity with climate change. It certainly means something different here than it does in the Western United States. And so to try to put a really briefly to try to put a hat on some of this, what does it mean, right? So the title of my talk is Seeing the Forest for the Trees, right? We are planting trees to try to tackle this intractable problem of climate change. But so I would argue that we need to not protect trees from fire, but we need to protect forests with fire. And so there's more and more data now showing that this is within our ability, that we can use fire, we can use controlled burning to actually increase carbon storage and carbon sequestration in many of these systems, including the dry pine forest that I've described, and also peatlands and other wetlands. So this is just one study that's telling us that we have these really, really great opportunities and even, what we're sampling in those peat sediments or in those paleo sediments is pyrogenic carbon, which is a very stable form of carbon, partially burned organic material. It doesn't break down. It holds up over long periods. So that's one more piece of all of this. So fire can be our friend, not our foe. And so and I started talking about structure and resistance and resilience, and I think about that a lot. And so this is a paper that came out a while back looking at like, functional diversity. So things like, you know, seed dispersal mechanisms and spatial structure and wood density and early and late seral species. So all these functional diversity traits that we'd expect with a disturbance regime. So it's fires that create the spatial heterogeneity in forests, and which in turn protects them from catastrophic fire down the road. So it's a self-feedback mechanism. And this paper is telling us that really forest structure is even more important than climate in terms of how forest systems operate and function. So this really should be, I would argue, we need to be thinking a lot more about these kinds of things rather than just what 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit means. And so, I've mentioned this already, but trees are part of the answer, and planting trees is one part of that answer. But really, we need to find ways to manage trees and forests with fire, not protect them from fire. And it was really these low severity fires that maintain resistance and resilience across these varying ecosystems. And we have an opportunity. We as managers, we as researchers have a real opportunity to think big and beyond just tree planting and facilitated migration. But we're slow to do that. It's arguably more difficult to measure and to do than sticking a seedling in the ground. And so I'll end on a Leopold quote. This is Aldo with his students at the UW Arboretum in a very early prescribed burn on the Curtis Prairie, circa 19 in the early 40s. And the quote he writes, present day problems in conservation and land use viewed in light of contemporary evidence alone often baffle the investigator. The same problem viewed in the light of history may often be deciphered as the repetition of some historic pattern. That historic pattern and that repetition is fires, and that really is the common theme through all of these different systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. A lot of information that you provided. And I think following up on your couple of last comments, the question I have or observation and wondering what your perspective is, Wisconsin DNR, Division of Forestry, to the best that they're able to track the amount of prescribed burning that we do every year here in Wisconsin, are estimating that among all of the different entities, from the U.S. Forest Service down to local agencies to nonprofit organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Ice Age Trail Alliance, and others, that we may be burning as many as 75,000 acres. And we in the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council we're working with DNR to try to significantly increase that amount of annual burning for the low frequency fires that you're talking about. And I'm wondering from all your research and your thoughts on how can we best apply this this effort to get more fire through our woodlands throughout the state in a way that will be done safely and not result in the catastrophic kind of fires.
Well, yeah, how to put more fire on the ground. So I think there are a lot of different pieces of that. One is we have to recognize fire dependent and fire adapted communities. So in the example of peatlands, we believe that good management of peatlands is protecting them from fire, and fire is going to risk their very value in terms of carbon and climate, right? And so, and what this data by Neil Flanagan, what my research has begun to show us, and what the research of others is showing us, is that when you exclude fire from peatlands, you actually change the composition of sphagnum mosses, and some of those mosses are prone to deeper drying, and therefore that's the scenario we're trying to avoid. Is you don't want to burn down to mineral soil and release 10,000 years of
Mm.
carbon accumulation. But, so some of it is knowledge about, this is how the system operated ecologically. This is the role of fire. And there's a great, to go right back to your question, there's the Hiawatha National Forest was planning on burning one of the study sites that I just showed you, the Bachelor Marsh, and doing a large, I think 5,000 acre prescribed burn, or maybe it was 3,000 acres, but incorporating peatlands into these sort of landscape scale fires. So that's new thinking. That's encouraging. So yeah, I mean, to really crack that nut though, we've got to get a better handle on fire. To we have to have a better relationship with risk, right? We can't be just risk averse. But I think it does start as a mindset, like preservation, protection doesn't. It's not a long-term solution. It's not for peatlands and it's not for the uplands. So we need to think about our systems as fire dependent, even when we don't, like with peatlands, we haven't thought of them that way. And that can open up the doors for landscape scale burns and actually doing something at scale rather
I,
than burn pieces.
yep, yep. Well, thank you. There are several questions that people have put in the Q&A, and just the invitation again, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A section here. I'm going to read a couple to you, Judd. The first one is, with the short mean fire return interval at that spot in northern Wisconsin, could you say a bit about the characteristics north versus south of the tension zone marked on that map?
So yeah, well, we do see a little bit shorter fire return intervals in many portions of the southern Wisconsin, so the driftless region, even the central sands. But and there is variability within the data, but by and large, I think the big take home in my mind is that we see relatively frequent fire across all these different types. So, we may have a slightly shorter return interval in the driftless or Baraboo Hills, but we have we have much, it varies a little. So in the Northern Highlands, say, which is our big piney landscape in north central Wisconsin, it's slightly longer. It's longer maybe than the Northwest or Northeast Sands even, but they're all short. They're all they're all 15 years approximately or less in most cases. So relatively short mean fire return intervals across the board.
And if I recall correctly from other presentations you've given on this, that short interval, return interval, definitely suggests that the native peoples here were using fire quite routinely to help manage the landscape, correct?
Well, I think yeah, I mean that I think there's no debating that. I think native fire use is well established, but I tend to a lot of my work is focused on really large scale fires. So I have a paper I wrote not long ago that looked at fires that burned clear across the entire Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm working on one now on fires that burned basically most of the Midwest, or at least the Lake states. So, patching together these really large fire events, many millions of acres. And those fire events have a very clear climate signal. So regardless of the ignition source, again, I could list maybe 12 or 15 of our largest fire years, and many of those years are back-to-back fire years, 1894, 1895. There are a lot of examples like that. So large fires with clear climate signals. So regardless of the ignition source, these fires could have burned underground, under snowpack all winter long, reignited in the spring the following year. So we had the Peshtigo fire of October 1871. We had there's a lighthouse on the Bay of Green Bay the green lighthouse, I think, it had its strobe going day and night for months because of all the smokes in the air. So fires were burning all through late August and September and through the beginning of October. And then a cold front and strong winds blew it up into a firestorm. What's the ignition source of that? Are we willing to say that the good fires that were low severity were human ignited and the bad one? I mean, it's hard to even distinguish those things. So there was lots of ignition, is my point.
Okay. Here's another one. This is quite specific. Could you please share the Razenkova et al. 2024 reference?
Yep, happy to. And it's open access, so I can find that and maybe right now even and put it in the chat.
Okay, now, and here's another one that, whoops, that goes to the what you've been talking about, the peatlands. Has there been any research into the water holding capacity of these peatlands after these low intensity smoldering fires? Does fire affect that?
Um, I don't know, actually. It's a good question. And I'm not sure if there's been research into that. I do think there's been a little work that I mentioned on various peat mosses and the way they hold water. And some mosses are more prone to deeper drying. So that's probably a bit of circling around maybe that question. But if others have ideas on that, I'd be curious to know that. But I'm not sure offhand.
Here's another one that goes to that issue of burning and peatlands. Is there typically prep that needs to be done to burn peatlands safely and get low intensity fire, similarly to the thinning and clearing of underbrush we are accustomed to with overly dense forested areas?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So just a couple thoughts. It seems like those moderately dry years, and I've been, having tr trampled all over these peatlands with a chainsaw and hiking around in them on years like those moderately wet years. So you have plenty of squishy wet stuff, that's a scientific term probably. But you've got some crunch on the top. So what we're talking about is the top 6 inches of peat is dry and below that is wet. So I think again that hydrology is really important. So those moderately wet years, but I suspect that you would need typical, similar to an oak woods maybe, you're gonna probably want a fairly consistent breeze to carry it across. Because what I think, in my mind at least, what you probably don't want is fire just sitting in one spot and traveling vertically. And I have pretty good evidence from photos and just anecdotally that those islands like that, I had a picture in there, and I'm thinking that island in particular, we had um we had all these fire scarred trees surrounding this little island, and they were all facing in. And what it appeared to me like is if you had a really strong wind event, you might expect the fire scars to be on the leeward side of all those trees, but they were all interior in the island, meaning it seemed like it was the peat that was carrying fire up into the upland. And and so just thinking about that in terms of ignition patterns and prescription. But yeah, I guess you probably would not want to burn these things, peatlands, on a exceptionally dry year, and you probably couldn't burn them on an exceptionally wet year. Seasonality is probably important too, and I think this is key. A lot of the big fire years that, were typically late summer, fall fires. So we tend to think about burning in the spring, and that might not work all that well in peatlands. I think they're probably were more typically late summer and fall fires.
Here's a puzzle perhaps for you. Um, when a tree falls in Door County, Wisconsin, what percentage of its carbon content remains in the forest at, say, 10 50, or 100 years?
Um, I don't know its percentage offhand, but what I will tell you is that a little bit of that carbon will get put back into soils, say. Um, Most of that carbon, when decomposition occurs on of that tree, will be respired back into the atmosphere. So I don't know a percent, but I do know that the bulk of that carbon will be in emissions back into the atmosphere. And so, and this is an interesting thought exercise. So think about this for a minute. The snags, the stumps, the dead material that I'm sampling for all this fire history has been these are things that were cut 150 years ago and they're solid as a rock. I can take a sample of them and bring them into my lab. There's no modern red pine tree that is cut or alive and dead is going to last 150 years. So fire has a way of hardening these things. So in terms of carbon dynamics, it's slowing down that carbon exchange, which is really what we're trying to do with a lot of our tree planting. But anyways, I think some carbon is put back into soils and stored. Very much of it is respired back into the atmosphere.
But thinking back to several of those early slides you showed with the graphs of the catastrophic fires, it seemed to point to that it would be several hundred years of slowly releasing the carbon, and then the conjunction of the new carbon being sequestered.
Oh, okay. And
Yeah.
maybe that's the question actually, not ultimately where it ends up, but how long that process takes. I think it's probably more rapid here than it is in, say, Yellowstone because we just have warmer growing seasons and more precipitation to help that decomposition process along. Um, I don't know if I'd venture a guess on that though. We'd have to watch we'd have to watch logs disappear, but I'm sure there are people on this who, you know, uh, managers who who've done that, who've actually, are familiar enough with a stand or whatever to know how long it takes for things to break down. But that's basically what we'd want to know.
Well, here's another one that sort of to that same topic. The knowledge that low severity regular fires can increase carbon sequestration is paradigm shifting. One of the wonders of biochar is that once it is secured safely in the ground, that is, away from future surface fires, it is immobilized until the next volcanic event. What are some ways we can encourage more fire on the ground and involve more people in prescribed burning?
Well, I love the comment and you're spot on. I think the the conversation we're having now, I think recognizing that, the role of what I'll call pyrogenic carbon, um, recognizing the role of fire in carbon dynamics, it's a burgeoning area of study right now, but the evidence is piling on that, with good management, and in my mind, good management includes fire, we can actually improve the situation with carbon dynamics. And I love biochar is a great analogy. I mean, that's what we're talking about in many cases is a pyrogenic carbon, and it's very stable. It lasts a very long time, and that's really cool to think about.
Well, the topic is continuing. So with this one, so for areas that are horribly damaged from pests and windthrow, would it retain more carbon if we burned it, i.e. hardened it, like you just were saying, or better to remove it to reduce fuel loading, or leave it as it is to decompose naturally?
Yeah. Well, okay. It's good. So if we think about this, let's just think about it from a systems perspective. Some of all of those options probably were occurring. So maybe it's scale at some level, but um, you know, um, so when I talk about hardened it's really it's especially important for red pine. Red pine, their Latin name is Pinus resinosa, so they're a fairly resinous pine to begin with. When they live through fires, they actually all pine that I know of, pines do this generally is a better way of saying it. They create more resin ducts. They have more resin. The resin helps ward off pests and pathogens, the original problem of the problem. And it helps them better tolerate drought, and it does harden them. The wood just lasts a long time. And that's probably true with most pines, if not all pines, especially red pine. So hardened can mean different things. But in this scenario, like if we're thinking about functional diversity, if we're thinking about complexity in our forests, I see so many wind throw events, even if they're small scale and even if they're on public lands, and we're very quick to salvage log. I think we should slow down and I do see a role for salvage logging. I'm not against logging, but what are we salvaging and at what cost? And is it necessary to bulldoze all the stumps over, or can we leave at least the tip ups for small seeded species like yellow birch to regenerate? So I think this is a larger conversation. I think we tend to jump into management action mode and we tend to clean things up. And there is a cost to that. There's a cost in terms of complexity, and there's a, there's and we're losing something potentially, and maybe even in the carbon cycle. So if the question's related to carbon, we might just be talking about scales at some level. But if it's related to fire and I see the word, fuel loading, there's a rationale for that too. So, but I think if we have healthy forests, that by and large we're talking about time scale. So, we can trade off how much carbon is below ground and below and above ground and what that means for resistance and resilience. We can manipulate structure so that we can have less catastrophic fire, and maybe salvage is part of that. So I don't think it's an all or nothing or one is the answer, but we need probably all of the above. And that's a way to skirt that question.
No, but I think from the question raised and what your response, I'm reflecting on my experience of more than 30 years of dealing with, various ecosystems. And yes, the tendency to want to have a kind of a nice, simple, clean outcome. Probably, as you're suggesting, is a mistake. That nature, so to speak, is much messier than all of that, much more cluttered.
Yeah.
Well, here's one that a question that sort of maybe goes toward your methods, and it's one of those ones. I guess it's intrigued me a lot too. The question is, how far back have you been able to gather data? Some of those largest fire years you mentioned seem to correlate with the large-scale removal of indigenous people from the landscape and the westward expansion of colonization.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and you're exactly right. 1891 being one that comes up to mind. So I now have data back to about 1330. The end of the Little Ice Age, and those trees, those older fire chronologies are in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, which probably I would suspect. I mean, there's certainly native presence there, but just due to the hostility of winters there, it would have been seasonal or maybe a different sort of land use history um, historically than other parts of the upper Midwest. So there's something to learn there, I think. But so we have a lot of we have some data as back as the early 1300s. I have samples in my lab that I haven't been able to lock in to existing chronologies that I'm pretty sure go back into the 1200s. So we've got a pretty long record, and a lot of that we have pretty good sample depth in the 16 and 1700s. So um, we depending on where you are and the chronology itself, it may lend itself better to these long analyses of longer periods of time. But we certainly have a pretty good record of European settlement era fires too. And I have wrote a paper on that not too long ago, which is just sort of interesting. But yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone who has asked questions, and obviously Jed for your responses. I think overall this suggests that this is a field of research that is still quite young, if you will, and open to a lot more good work like you're doing to deepen and enrich our understanding of the dynamics of fire and disturbance of various kinds and the biotic systems that persist through them.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks, everybody.
Um, I do want to tell you all about several other events that are coming up in the near future that you may find of interest. As I mentioned, I am a volunteer with the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council, which exists to foster the increased use and safe use of prescribed fire to manage the fire-dependent ecosystems of Wisconsin. And so we have been working with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for several years now to develop what is called the Wisconsin Certified Prescribed Burn Boss Program, which is a program that will ultimately enable the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to certify as qualified people to lead burns in all kinds of ecosystems. There's a QR code here that you can click on to find out more about this particular program. And one of the aspects of to enable all of this to happen, again, the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council has been collaborating with University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and Wisconsin DNR to organize, and we will be hosting a first ever Wisconsin Burn Boss Academy the week of September 22nd and 26th at Tree Haven in northern Wisconsin, and there's a QR code there on the screen for how you can find out more information about this Burn Boss Academy and how you can apply to be part of it. And then coming up more recently than that is in July 8th to 10th, we will be hosting the third annual Northeast Midwest Regional Prescribed Fire Workshop, a virtual workshop. So like this webinar, you can zoom in on it. Its focus is going to be, or theme is going to be, the many cultures of fire. And among the presenters are Stephen J. Pine, probably the foremost historian of fire, will be one of the presenters on July 8th. So I encourage folks, if you're interested in learning more about this on a regional basis. By the region, we're talking about Region 9 of the U.S. Forest Service, the 20 states of the Northeast and the Midwest being involved. And then last but not least, on June 4th, the next webinar in this series will discuss prescribed fire and timber quality with Dr. Mike Saunders of Purdue and Joe Marshall from the University of Missouri. And so I want to also ask you and to remind you to evaluate the session today. And there's a QR code here for you to click on to do that. And otherwise, I hope you Have a lovely day and a happy spring, and do good work on the land.